Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sree's Global COVID-19 Show. My name is Sree Sreenivasan, and it's my honor to convene this weekly conversation around various aspects of the crisis. We have talked extensively about the healthcare situation, extensively about the economic situation, extensively about the racial justice implications of the pandemic. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic and an episode that's a year plus in the making about the global supply chain crisis. If you are like me, you have experienced various examples and side effects of this supply chain crisis, and you will get a chance to learn all about it and get your questions answered by Christopher Mims. He has a big new book out, arriving today, From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy. He'll talk about his book, supply chains, and why so much of what we want to get is unavailable, late, or more expensive. And I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by my wife, Roopa Unnikrishnan, who's a corporate strategist and a former guest on this show. So we're excited to have her with us as well. She knows a lot about this topic, and she will help me ask questions of Chris. But you'll meet them in just a moment. But first, hi, everybody. I'm the Marshall Loeb Visiting Professor of Digital Innovation at the Stony Brook School of Communication and Journalism, and the co-founder of Digimentors, a social, digital, and virtual events consulting business. And we are just so thrilled to be able to be with you every week, but we wish it was under other circumstances. If you haven't seen the show before, we were on the air for 250 days in a row. And then we moved to a weekly format. We've had more than 545 guests, including 311 women, yes, we counted, from 75 cities and 22 countries, including the chief scientist of the World Health Organization. We're in partnership with Scroll Global and Scroll.in, and our archives are at youtube.com/SreenET. Please hit subscribe and get those notifications. The show is made possible by the efforts of our awesome producers, Rose Horowitz at Rose Horowitz 31, and Vandana Menon, Vandana_Menon. Please follow both of them on social. They'll be live tweeting and sharing a lot of what is going on today. Want to tell you very quickly about our company, Digimentors. We do conferences, summits, webinars, talk shows, and as I was explaining to somebody, one of the reasons we're super busy is because of the pandemic. And on this show, you've heard me rant and rail against the anti-maskers, vax people. Our business benefits from the extension of the pandemic, unfortunately. So I would like nothing more than the pandemic to be over and for us to pivot back to doing fewer of the things that are being forced for our clients to be done on the virtual side because of the pandemic. But we expect, of course, to see a lot of hybrid events in the months and years ahead. And we are going to be talking today about various aspects of the global supply chain, and you'll meet Chris Mims in just a minute. But first, let me bring on my wife, Roopa, so she can say hello to all of you. She is a corporate strategist. And hi, Roopa.
Hi there.
I should tell everybody where I am before I tell them where you are. I am in our daughter's bedroom. She's gone off to college, and I'm here in this setting because you've got the better seat in the house, the best seat for being on camera, as you should. And I know that you and I have talked so much about the supply chain crisis. You've been ordering things for the kids for their respective colleges and found that to be problematic. And just from your work and what you have seen, tell me your thoughts on the kind of supply chain issues.
I think we've always, this is, like many things in business, there's been this sort of pendulum swing. This is one of those pendulum swings that has been on for decades, right? We had this sort of really inexorable move towards the east in many ways, right, where manufacturing was getting sent out. And the result, though, is this sort of global supply chain that Chris writes so evocatively about. But there's always risks to whichever system you put yourself into. And I think there's a lot of thinking out there about what's happening to innovation, what's happening to customer expectations, what's happening to quality. Lots that sort of getting more complicated as supply chains get as complex and global as they've been. A lot of discussions that I'm sure we can have with Chris about the implications of the geopolitics of today and potentially tomorrow, whether it's COVID or beyond that, right? There's a lot that's going to be complicating this sort of simplified view that we might have about like pressing a button and expecting things to get to us. I think we're all learning that that's not the way the world turns anymore. So it'll be interesting to hear how Chris's in-depth sort of. I hear from sort of having flipped through that he's been in many of these venues, inside ports, inside warehouses. So I'm looking forward to hearing what he learned. In my case, I've sort of done my experiences have been in businesses like pharma and consumer electronics, etc., all of which, as you know, have very, very complex supply chains. So it's not a trivial matter at all.
And I know you think a lot about this, so I'm so glad that you're here with me tonight. You were a guest on one of our very earliest episodes, which Rose Horowitz hosted, talking about women and leadership. It was fantastic, but it was more than, 15 months ago. So without further ado, let's get going and bring onto the stage our friend Christopher Mims, who's the author of Arriving Today, From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy. He's also a Wall Street Journal tech reporter and someone who has been deeply studying and researching this very important topic. And I love the title of the book too, Arriving Today. So please welcome onto our stage our friend Chris Mims. Hi, Chris.
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're delighted to have you. Our first question always, Chris, is how are you, where are you, and how has your family been handling the pandemic?
I'm good. I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, but I'm actually in a tiny mill town, which was is older than the United States of America, and it's a very idyllic place to kind of ride out the pandemic. And of course, I'm also very reliant on getting things delivered to me, given where I am, like we all have been. So like us all, I'm experiencing a lot of the challenges that we have in supply chains and their disruptions. I'm experiencing those firsthand.
Sure, and I can imagine that also when you have a family and you're out there. We are in Manhattan on the Upper West Side, and sometimes it feels like it's hard to get things here. I imagine it's harder even when you're kind of out of the way a little bit. So tell us about the genesis of this book, and then Roopa is going to ask you some questions.
So, I am by trade a tech reporter. I didn't, start out reporting on logistics. I was reporting on robotics, and I was in London and on its outskirts, and I visited, probably the world's most automated warehouse, which is actually built by a company called Ocado, which does grocery delivery in the UK. They also have subsequently, Kroger has spent billions licensing their technology, trying to bring it to the US. And I was just utterly fascinated by this field of robots, by this giant warehouse that was, had only maybe 4 humans inside of it, that was doing all this grocery fulfillment. And I just thought, this is what I was told the future was going to be. Like, this is that Matrix moment when Neo wakes up and he sees nothing but machines. That's all I saw on that day. And I just thought, I have to know more about this. I have to understand where this is going, how quickly this type of automation and AI is going to take over in other fields. And what I subsequently discovered when I set out to write a book about these supply chains and how they're being transformed by automation is that as much technology as is being incorporated into them, they're still incredibly labor intensive. And most of the change in the way that technology has been incorporated in the supply chains is in how it's used to manage the people involved. I mean, that said, everything from a robotic warehouse to a giant container ship represents essentially, an enormous robot, an enormous piece of automation, which makes the humans, which are still involved with it, far more effective. Of course, it doesn't lead to mass unemployment because all of us just keep consuming more through the process of delivery, right? We've all become endpoints at the end of this supply chain, where in the past, the endpoint was the store. Now it's our house. It takes a great deal more automation and labor.
Thank you. And just to, as I said, I complimented you on the title of the book. So tell us a little bit more about the title, and then I'm going to hand it over to Roopa.
I credit to my editor at HarperCollins, Hollis Heimbach. She came up with the title. I had something way more tortured to begin with, but she just said to me, hey, I get these alerts on my phone. It doesn't matter where I order from, saying like, it's going to be arriving today. Why don't we call the book that? So that will evoke for people that moment. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Because the entire purpose of the book was to describe how, a thing that is you order and that comes tomorrow is actually, it went on a 14,000 mile multi-month journey before it ever got to you. So what does that journey actually look like?
Excellent. So I'm going to hand this over to my co-host, Roopa Unnikrishnan, who is a corporate strategist and who knows a lot about the supply chain. So over to you, Roopa.
A pleasure at being here on this call, Chris. It's funny, Sree and I were watching a show earlier today yesterday, I guess, with the comedian Ronnie Chen, and he talks about this sort of shift in consumer behavior, how, press the button and you want something here, but not just do you want it here, but you want it to be handed to you. And he says the next stage is when they help you chew whatever it is that you're ordered, so you can, and, of course, as a comedian, but I think this sort of expectation around instant gratification has sort of gotten pretty intense these days. What is your sense? I mean, earlier this morning I was having a conversation with Robert Walcott of Booth School, and he talks about proximity, this idea of how production is going to be, production to consumption is going to be zero, as in like zero distance between production and consumption. That's the ultimate hope. Do you see that happening? Because this idea of this pendulum shift from everything being done, shipped over, sitting in warehouses, is that sort of going to be breaking down eventually, thanks to these technologies, which might make production actually happen closer to the consumption point? Are you seeing any of those indicators?
Maybe. I mean, I think one of the things that I really came to respect in the course of reporting this book were the laws of physics. And, there are only so many people, there's only so much energy, there's only so many factories. So I think that, the idea that we click on something and then it arrives, Amazon has said their goal is that, a drone will deliver it in like 30 minutes or less. There are a number of startups now that will get you groceries in 30 minutes, 15 minutes. That's kind of the new bar. But to make that happen depends entirely on predictive analytics, which often depends on machine learning, because the system has to be sort of preloaded with whatever it is you might want. We've become accustomed to those systems being quite good at moving goods close to us. So I think that it's true that we have moved to a world of instant gratification. But I think the idea that, something will be produced and then immediately in your hands, it just sort of doesn't actually reflect the reality that it still has to be manufactured, it still has to be grown, it still has to be processed. I do think that, the world is less flat now. We may see some relocalization of manufacturing, but those supply chains are very hard to move. There are things like expertise and tribal knowledge that you can't just transplant. If you want to look at the supply chain for any sophisticated piece of electronics, it's not just that the chips have to be made in one place and the thing has to be assembled in another. It's that the incredibly specialized knowledge to do every single one of those steps is now localized in places that, you and I don't even think about, Yeah. So it's very difficult to move all of that next door to you as much as people want to. So I think we're kind of stuck with the supply chains we have. which means in a lot of ways we're stuck with the shortages we have now. Like people are talking about, we're not going to work through them completely until, early 2022. Some people are saying 2023.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a bunch of reasons for that.
No, and it's interesting. I feel like I've seen that whole shift. There was the profit motive in business, of course, takes precedence sometimes over everything else, of course, right? And I think there was this shift towards, okay, should we single source so we can get to scale, we can get to the right economics. And then about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, there were enough disruptions thanks to natural disasters, right? That people started saying maybe we should dual source. And I think that sort of there's that sort of shift in the thinking where maybe there's a element of, okay, how much profit are we willing to let go of in order to actually get, de-risk the business, becomes another part of the conversation, which I think earlier had kind of gotten, because we had this sort of sense of false sense of confidence in the sort of robustness of the supply chain. I think that's getting to be a little more tempered now. What do you feel like that's happening? When you did your walkabouts, did you see any of that, or did you do your research pre-COVID, so you hadn't actually gotten a sense of that?
Well, everything that you talked about was in motion before COVID, and let's not forget that before COVID happened, people were concerned about a trade war between China and the U.S. They were concerned about a shooting war between China and the U.S. I mean, those are major disruptions. Those are reasons why every manufacturer you can name who has traditionally done things in China was dual sourcing, moving factories, duplicating factories in Southeast Asia.
Right.
The challenge is, though, it's not just that supply chains are long, it's that manufacturing itself has become a supply chain. It's not like the old days where raw materials go into a factory and a finished product comes out and then you got to move it to the end consumer. Every single component, there are more than 300 components in your smartphone. Each one of them has as many different supply chains. I mean, if we want to trace the microchip alone, you're talking about, sand from Appalachia turned into ingots of pure silicon in Australia, cut into wafers in Southeast Asia, in Korea, and then etched into chips in Taiwan, packaged elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Then it goes to China, where it's assembled into a phone and is linked up with 299 other components, each of which has equally complex supply chains. So what ends up happening is that there can be a disruption anywhere along that supply chain. And so, it's not enough even, I think, to dual source for any particular component. People are just having to become more flexible in general. They're having to kind of multi-source every single part of it. They're having to ask, where do their subcontractors, where their suppliers get their parts from? Because as you said, the profit motive has been to just thin that out. Nobody should hold any inventory. Everyone should try to squeeze every penny they can. But at this point, you have, to go back to the example of chips, you have people willing to pre-buy the capacity of, chip packagers, for example, so that they have enough money to invest to increase their capacity in the future. And I think you're going to see that happen everywhere up and down the supply chain. You're going to see it happen with really basic things like shipping containers. People are going to start pre-buying. They're already pre-booking. Right. IKEA is buying its own shipping containers. It's the only way they can guarantee supply. So I think everyone's going to spend a lot of money. They've all been sitting on a ton of cash, so they've got it, in order to guarantee their own supplies of all of these different components and everything they need to move them.
I just want to step in here to just read some of our comments and to thank everybody who's been sharing this conversation. I've already learned a lot, and I hope you'll all share this. That's Chris Mims, and he's at Mims on Twitter. What a great handle. And that's Roopa Unnikrishnan at Roopa Online. And we are talking to Chris about the global supply chain crisis. And let's see who's watching from all over the world. Linda is watching from Long Island. There's an interesting topic. Apollo is watching from Philadelphia. Hi, Apollo. And Apollo's a former guest on the show himself. And he says, "You guys are so sweet." I think he's talking about Roopa and me. Neil is watching from Springfield. Neil's part of our awesome Digimentors team, as is Rose Horowitz, who's watching. And she says she's excited to hear about the global supply chain issues because it's something she's covered as a journalist, which is awesome. And I knew we would get some complaints about the supply chain, so I think we have our first one here. I've been trying to get a glass lampshade replacement for over a year, but Brand says shipments aren't coming from China. It's frustrating. So obviously we're not doing customer service here, Chris, but what can you tell us about this feeling which so many of us have multiple times a week?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't think Americans have experienced a supply shock like this in a long time. I mean, maybe the last time there was one this comprehensive was like the Arab oil embargo in the late 70s. A lot of these issues are just not going to work themselves out anytime soon. I actually have a friend who, a couple of handles broke off her sink. And when they broke off, she flipped them over and she realized that they had actually 3D printed an insert, because even before she had bought this condo, which was less than a year ago, clearly they couldn't get replacements. She was looking at them, realized she couldn't replace them, realized she was going to have to buy a whole new sink because she could not fix this one part. So I think, and you hear tons of companies who have issues like this where they can't get a particular part. I mean, don't forget GM just shut down production of all light duty vehicles for 2 months. I mean, that's catastrophic. That's like a wartime event. But here we just accept it as being every day. I mean, I think that there are going to be countless things where, we have become accustomed to just this infinite consumer variety, right? And the internet has really accelerated that. And, Alibaba and Amazon have really, and their equivalents elsewhere, have really kind of spoiled us for choice. And I think we are going to return to a different era for the next 18 months, 2 years, maybe longer, where you just can't get a lot of those things. People are going to have to accept whatever it is they can get. There's going to be a lot less variety. There's going to be, critical shortages for some industries. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better.
That's scary. We heard of somebody who was redoing their kitchen and had to settle for their 7th choice in a countertop. And anyone who's redone a kitchen knows that the countertop is so important, and the principal designers, are very picky about at least the first, maybe 1 or 2 choices, but to go all the way to 7 is surprising. Jonathan, who has watched, by the way, every single episode of the show, 287 episodes, Roopa would admit that she has not seen all of them, but he has watched from the East Village, and he says, chalk it up to global supply problems at IKEA. So he's blaming IKEA for various things. But tell us, are no companies immune to this, even masters of the supply chain like IKEA?
There are companies who have, reserved shipping, well in advance, who have those relationships. And, let's remember that this is both a supply and demand issue in terms of shipping capacity. I mean, I think that net consumer spending in the US on goods has gone up about 5% in the past year. Sounds like not a lot. 5%, but it's 5% of everything that we buy. So it's hundreds of billions of dollars. It's countless tens of thousands of containers worth of goods. So, if you're Walmart, if you're IKEA, there's lots of stuff that you already have. You have already booked that capacity on the ships that are there. But, no one's immune, and that they're all going to have that one thing that is not on shelves, or those replacements that are not available. And what the people who are really going to get squeezed out at the margins are the folks who we're used to paying, $2,000 per container to ship goods from China to the US. Now it's $14,000, $15,000 per container if you can get one. There are tons and tons of suppliers of lower margin goods who may just go out of business. I actually had a journalist call me yesterday because she's working on a package about supply chain shocks and how they're affecting schools. So if you can't get basics like pencils, school supplies, desks, backpacks, it's affecting school lunch programs because of snarls and trucking. Not that there isn't enough food, there aren't enough trucks to move it. And it's even worse in some countries like the UK right now, where Brexit has really hurt them in terms of their trade links and their ability to get truck drivers to move goods.
Thank you. I'm going to send this back to Roopa in just a second, but just want to say hello to Chris Gorman, who's watching in New York City, Adarsh, who's watching in India, and back to you, Roopa.
Thank you. I mean, it's really kind of interesting to hear you sort of talk about things like the trucking issues, right? I mean, like it was some of this raises this sort of question about to what extent is ESG even being acknowledged as a potential disruptor? So the sustainability, the shift towards sustainability, the shift towards environmental responsibility. I think there's been a lot of talk for many decades, but it feels like it's coming to a head now. Are you spending time in DC at all, or do you see some of these implications as people sort of maybe do buy less, buy differently, potentially look at local sourcing, etc.? Is this going to actually shift the way companies behave? I think the thing that raised it for me was, I think yesterday or today, Maine has decided that it's going to put the onus of recycling on companies versus, currently all the onus falls and cost and onus falls on the consumer. They're shifting the cost to companies. I think as such sort of regulations come into play, I wonder what that's going to do to supply chains, because we are starting to be able to track, carbon footprint, transport, costs, etc. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the short term, people have shifted their spending from, entertainment, going out, travel, hospitality, to goods. So in the short term, everybody's sort of thing-based carbon impact has gone way up. I do think that there are opportunities here for people to rethink things, in that there has just been this global pause. And whenever there's a big disruption like this, people sort of have the opportunity to redirect their time and their resources. I mean, I think a lot of the corporate environmental responsibility stuff has sort of proceeded apace. I think that psychologically, putting everyone on the planet in a place where they feel very vulnerable does allow for a reassessment. And I think it's part of the reason that we are hearing so much more about climate change this summer. Obviously, there have been, probably an unprecedented number of extreme weather events and disasters. Well, let's keep in mind that we had giant forest fires wiping out whole neighborhoods in places like Oregon in 2020. People were a little more distracted at that time. So I think that, there is now this willingness to listen and say, okay, we really have to do something about this. Even if you're one of these giant oil companies, they're like, we really have to do something about this. We dug all this carbon out of the ground. Now you should pay us to stick it back in the ground. It's a bit opportunistic, but right. Yeah, everyone is thinking along these lines. Everyone is more open to it. All the technologies continue to mature, whether it's renewable energy or, lightweighting materials that go into our transportation infrastructure.
Right. And wastage, right? I mean, there's a lot of waste that must go along this pipeline.
The waste is visible now because China won't take it anymore. I mean, this is a major, major snag in the global supply chains, believe it or not, is that China's and Southeast Asia's refusal to take all of our plastic and cardboard anymore. That's what we used to fill those empty shipping containers with and send them back. Now those shipping containers are stuck here because no one is sending those recyclables back. So, in most places, all that recycling that we put in our bins it's being buried or it's being incinerated. So absolutely, it's creating this kind of emergency situation where suddenly we're drowning in trash at the city level, and people, cities are recognizing they have to do something about it. And that means that, of course, now there's a huge waste stream which can be transformed domestically.
Right. So I want to switch tracks a little and hear a little bit about your own reporting experiences, because I saw that you'd traveled in an 18-wheeler and spent time in an Amazon warehouse. Tell us a little bit. Any war stories that you think would be fun for our folks here?
Yeah, I really should. I really should just like put together like a slideshow of these things because just for my own reference, as I was going, I snapped a bunch of pictures, and there are some really memorable moments. I mean, one of the most memorable was being in the port of LA, traveling with the harbor pilots. So every single large ship that has to come in is everything. 90% of everything you own comes in by ship. And for every single one of those items to come in by ship, there is a moment when a single human being has to risk his or her life every time. And the way that works is you go out on these pilot boats, it's 4 a.m., it's pitch black. You're coming up alongside something that's literally the dimensions of the Empire State Building. There's spray in your face, there's wind, there's this terrific chop in the water. And this highly skilled pilot that's in the pilot boat is sort of matching exactly the speed of this very large container ship, and then two more men go on deck, and one of them is this extremely skilled harbor pilot who gets paid in excess of $400,000 a year because their job is so specialized and so difficult. And then they have to sort of stand there, and as these two ships are rising and falling independent of one another, time it just right so that he can sort of delicately hop or leap onto what to this day is still a rope ladder. And then he has to scramble up the ladder before the surge of the ocean catches him, and then he'll get sucked in and he'll go through the rotors, he'll be dead. And then he has to scramble up the side of the boat. All of this has to happen just to get a single harbor pilot onto a ship to successfully navigate it into the port of LA, which is where like 40% of our imports from Asia come into in the US. Of course, this happens in ports all over the world hundreds of times a day. And if you want to know what happens when you don't have an adequate harbor pilot on board, well, that's why the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal.
Right.
So, moments like that really stuck out of my mind. I mean, certainly riding along with truck drivers was riding with a truck driver during an ice storm was amazing because it really brought home for me that in supply chains, there's no such thing as unskilled labor, right? Every single one of those truck drivers, in order to keep from killing themselves and other people on the road, has all of these specialized skills, and they have to do it for what is literally 14 hours per day. So, as hard as you think it is to like stay alert, imagine that your stopping distance is a football field long, and you have to be that alert for that long. 21 days out of every month, you don't see your family. You're sleeping in the cab of your truck. So being with the people who make this happen, whether it was a longshoreman who's operating a crane, or Somali immigrants who are trying to organize their highly automated Amazon warehouse in Shakopee, Minnesota, because they want better working conditions. It's unbelievable the amount of work, the amount of just blood, sweat, and tears that goes into our supply chain every single day.
That's fascinating. I mean, can I ask you? So you talk about the skilled labor in a truck. I mean, so I come from the mobility side of the world, and we've been watching closely as autonomous drive sort of potentially comes into play. I think it's going to happen. You know about Otto, which is the company that does autonomous trucks, for example. But being in that big rig, right? Do you see that happening anytime soon, where autonomy really will come into play?
Yeah, and so not only did I spend time with a truck driver, I went really deep with the CTO of TuSimple, which of course is Otto's big competitor in the US. Yeah. We went down to the granularity of like, how does the math work in their algorithms that drive their autonomous trucks. Here's the bottom line. Those systems keep getting better. The one thing I am not hearing, and this is the major barrier to us getting autonomy on the road, no one is agitating for the kind of regulation that would be required to make it happen. And I'll tell you exactly what that regulation is. If we don't have laws saying how many people those trucks or any autonomous vehicle are allowed to kill, and I'm putting it that bluntly because that's exactly what it is, yep, we will not get autonomy on the road. And the reason is no system is ever perfect. And right now, the bar is all of these companies are terrified that the first time they have an accident, it'll be exactly what happened with Uber's autonomous driving system, which if you remember, that group was basically mothballed and then sold off. So if the bar is you cannot have any accidents, because it will be such bad publicity. They will never roll out autonomy because they will be pursuing that perfection forever. So until somebody says, here's the law that evaluates how good our autonomy is, apples to apples with humans, and here's the point at which it becomes better, which arguably is the point at which it becomes acceptable to deploy. Until we have those laws, until you have somebody who can figure out a way to sell that to the public, you will not see autonomy on our roads. 100% of the systems you are talking about still have a human driver in the cab. The only exception is Waymo's self-driving system, which is low speed, it's daylight, it's in Phoenix, they don't drive in inclement weather. I know they're testing it in San Francisco, but TBD when they'll take the safety drivers out of those San Francisco cars.
No, I think it's never been asked as starkly as you did, which is how many people are they allowed to kill. But, you watch that with consumer cars and the Tesla. Every time there's a Tesla mishap, we know we've taken, many miles steps backwards. I'm going to ask a question that Jigar Mehta just raised, which is, are consumers demanding companies have more transparent supply chains? Are you seeing that? Are you hearing that? Are the sort of components of the supply chain aware of how they're reporting it out? What are you seeing out there?
I think that's a great question. I think that when somebody figures out how to make that really accessible, it'll be one of those things where, someone will say, no one was specifically asking for this, but I just knew they would want it. And that's why, I'm a genius in launching this startup. Even companies that can provide that kind of transparency, because they work with some of these more data-driven, freight forwarders like Flexport. Flexport can tell you where your container is and when it's going to get there. But, I talked to somebody who ran an outdoor furniture startup, saw obviously a huge spike in demand last spring and over the summer during COVID time because people wanted to entertain in their backyards. He knows where his couches are. He does communicate with some of his customers about that. That has created a lot of goodwill because they tell him like, okay, cool. As long as I know where, it is. I mean, that's an old psychological trick. Like, every, user experience designer knows that if you put the right kind of progress bar on the screen, people will wait 2-3 times as long for something to load. I'm just frankly shocked that people haven't tried to do that with supply chains. I think that the reason they haven't done it is they haven't needed to until now because things were available whenever they said they were. Right.
And I see Apollo has a question here. I don't know if you can see it, Chris. What about the reindustrialization to manage recycling and manufacturing? Are the economies of scale there for positive investment? Is there wealth to be made?
Yeah,
I mean, there, but
I think a lot of unicorns are going to be built on just plain old manufacturing, materials handling, industrialization, and a lot of it is going to hopefully be relocalized within countries because I think it's becoming clear that it doesn't make economic or energetic sense to manufacture goods in Asia, ship them 14,000 miles to the US, people use them up, they get scrapped, the scrap gets shipped back to Asia. That part of the supply chain has already broken down completely. I think there is a lot of opportunity there. Somebody's gonna have to figure out how to close that loop in a way that helps them, either deliver goods more quickly or gives them an advantage in the minds of consumers. It's a challenge to figure out how to make the economics of that work because again, so much of the knowledge of how to do that kind of thing tends to be localized in one part of the world or another. I mean, that said, you can never count, especially the US out. It's still kind of, the US still makes about the same amount of stuff as China, just with many fewer people because of automation.
Right. I see that Robert's just written about how smartphones and laptop rollouts have slowed. And I think this is something that we've been expecting given the chip shortage. Talk a little bit about sort of the difference you may have seen among, pure electronic supply chains versus other types of sort of maybe food and other more maybe fashion, like the more in quotes simple supply chains that are out there. Did you see there's a sort of significant difference, or is it just just apples to apples in many ways.
I mean, there are no simple supply chains other than what happens at your local farmer's market.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you're buying food from within 100 miles of you, that's a simple supply chain. Everything else gets routed all around the world. It doesn't matter what it is. You know, textiles go through South Asia and Southeast Asia. Electronics go through East Asia. It doesn't matter what it is, right? Like all of the supply chains have been moved overseas. I mean, there are a few exceptions. I happen to have a cousin who works at a giant pump manufacturer in upstate New York. So if you need a big pump, you can get that right here, made in America. All the components straight from American steel as well. But that's the exception rather than the rule. You know, every supply chain is different, but at this point, every supply chain seems to be disrupted to one degree or another. You know, electronics, it's especially acute because those supply chains and the manufacturing chains, which, you know, come before things are finished goods, are so long, they're so complicated. And frankly, they go through parts of the world now that are intermittently shutting down their ports, right? China has a zero COVID policy. We don't think about that a lot in the US, but that means China's regularly shutting down, you know, one of the 7 largest ports in the world for a month. They'll shut down an entire city for a month.
Right.
So it's hugely disruptive. Same thing with Southeast Asia. Vietnam is going through shutdowns again. You know, your AirPods, most smartphones are actually made in Vietnam. They're not made in China.
Right. Paula asked a really good question, which is about, like, you know, a lot of these supply chains rely on shipping. What are the insurers saying? Which I think is a great question. I actually haven't heard or read enough about what insurers are doing in this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know the answer. I think, you know, the reinsurers have their hands full with climate disasters right now and reevaluating that type of risk. I mean, let's keep in mind, and this is probably a good time to make this point. Supply chains are not just disrupted because of COVID. It's just that's the elephant in the room. But, you know, we're seeing many disruptions because of extreme weather. You're seeing disruptions because of you know, political unrest. I mean, South Africa shut down a major port because of their political unrest. These things normally, I think, would be at the top of the news cycle. They're less visible because everybody's dealing with sort of their personal emergency of whether they can go out with a mask and whether their family members are safe. But these supply chains are seeing multiple disruptions right now. It's kind of, in a way, just a string of terrible luck.
Thank you. I want to take this question and this topic, which is so interesting, in a slightly different direction. We have talked and we've been sort of complaining a little bit about how bad the supply chain is, but we should also be grateful that it has held up as much as it has, right? Every pandemic movie that we've seen, every science fiction writer always predicted a world where, like, the internet shuts down, there's no food supply, everything goes to heck or hell. And in so many ways, at least here in America, things have held up. There are delays. Some of your luxury goods are not available, et cetera, but the basics are still available. Those runs on toilet paper we saw in March 2020, they've sort of disappeared, though in some places they're popping up again. So talk about that aspect and how much we should look at the bright side, if there is any.
Yeah, I mean, there is a tremendous amount of extra capacity in the system because we have all become so accustomed to this just incredible cornucopia, this bounty of variety. I mean, I wrote an article 4 years ago now about why there are just more objects on the shelves in stores than ever. And a lot of it has to do with the internet and Facebook and the ability of small companies to start up and find, and bootstrap themselves and find an audience early on, and, you know, targeted advertising through Facebook and all the rest. So global supply chains have already been expanded tremendously over the past decades to accommodate this incredible variety of goods. And you know, let's not forget the rise of the global middle class. You know, it's like 1 billion, 2 billion people being lifted out of poverty in the past 20 or 30 years. So there is more than enough capacity in these supply chains to get everybody the basics. Like, if you need, like, toilet paper, there may be temporary disruptions, but, like, those paper mills and those truckers, you know, can redirect their efforts to get you what you need. You know, there may be less variety of foodstuffs on the shelf, but food is still, you know, available. You know, again, we're very lucky in the US because not only do we have a great deal of manufacturing, we have a tremendous amount of natural resources, right? Like, we suddenly became a net exporter of oil and natural gas. Who would have guessed that would have happened 10 years ago? We're producing, a majority of the world's commodity food stuff that are exported. Some other places are having problems. I mean, they're having supply chain disruptions now that threaten, up to 20 or 30% of the soybeans that are imported into China every year, because they come from the US, are having trouble getting them onto break bulk ships. But, here in the US, like, we have this incredible bounty of all of these things. So yes, we are very lucky. We're incredibly lucky that we also have the materials we need to manufacture these vaccines, to manufacture them domestically. There's literally a vaccine factory 10 miles from my house right now, here in Baltimore, of all places. So supply chains are enormous. They're being overtaxed, but that means they're being well used right now. And a lot of the shortages have to do with this tremendous demand for one thing that there wasn't demand for before crowds out something else. And yeah, a lot of times maybe the other thing is less important. Does somebody need exactly the right countertop or exactly the right handles for their sink? We've become spoiled, maybe not.
Okay, Roopa has one final question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I had to, when Sree raised your book, and I thought, perfect timing. But how much pressure did you face from your publisher when the Suez crisis was going on to just like get stuff out there, get you out?
Well, this is a funny thing about book publishing. It went the other way. Book publishing is this incredibly slow process, and some of the delays are kind of inexplicable. So I remember corresponding with my editor and my agent and being like, this seems like such a perfect time to get this out there. Unfortunately for the world, fortunately for this book, the supply chain crises just keep getting worse. So I hesitate to say this, but we might as well just kind of get this out there right now. This year, Christmas is going to be really bad for a lot of people who are accustomed to getting whatever they need, the latest thing. I mean, personally, I think probably we should make it a much less consumer-centric holiday in the United States. But, traditionally, this is the time when shippers would be gearing up for holiday shopping, and they can't get capacity on ships. So this is kind of ongoing, and I hope that people can read this book in order to get more of a sense of what's going on and why there are disruptions. Not just if you're a business leader, but I wrote it for me. I'm just an everyday person. I'm just a journalist. I'm not a CEO. I wrote it out of a genuine, basic, childlike curiosity. I just picked up things in my ass and I'm like, where did this come from? Why don't I know who made this? Like,
right.
What is this odd world that I live in? You can know that. You can know how it came to you. I think doing so has the potential to make you sort of a more empathetic, conscientious global citizen, just a citizen of the world, right? It's like that astronaut effect of they go up and they look at the curve of the Earth and they're like, oh, we all live on this kind of spaceship and we have a collective responsibility for it. You have an intimate connection to people on the other side of the world who you'll never meet because they made something with their own hands, which you then rely on in your everyday life. We don't have to have that alienation of being like, what is this? It just came from Amazon. It didn't come from Amazon.
Right. Yeah, I think you just laid out a potential plan for an app that I feel like should already exist, but if not, we should be planning that. Also realized that I can get away with lumps of coal and oranges this Christmas, so that could be fun.
Rose says, could you just talk about the viability of these huge container ships? It was a $100 million settlement for the Evergreen, but do they have to be this huge? Do they have to be the Empire State Building on the side? Can there be smaller things? Are there other ways of transportation, etc.?
Yeah. If you follow, Y Combinator's demo day, somebody just proposed that we bring back airships for like middle mile transportation. I don't know how viable that will.
Oh, you mean like blimps? Is that right? Like blimps?
Yeah. Rigid, semi-rigid airships, blimps. Okay. Because of the economics of this, large ships tend to work better. I think we've reached probably a sort of logical end to how big they can be because ports just can't accommodate them at this point. But yeah, there's really only so much capacity. If we want more capacity, governments are going to have to spend billions, tens of billions, expanding capacity at ports all over the world. That's really a rate limiter at this point, even more than the
and
ships.
Alvarez says airships helium is scarce, so that's going to be a problem. Linda says I've already done my Christmas shopping for that exact reason, because so she is early September already done. Maybe one of the things you could do, Linda, is offer a service like personal shopping for Christmas in October, and I bet you'll have people want to work with you. Very quickly, Aparna says, is if not now, then when is nearshoring to become a reality? And I'm sorry to say, I don't know what that is. I'm always learning from Aparna, who is watching from the main line tonight.
Yeah. So obviously offshoring and moving manufacturing overseas, nearshoring is moving it back. I think that it's going to be a subtle shift where companies that have more robust supply chains and engage in some amount of nearshoring, they're just going to be the ones who have product to sell. So if you want to talk about massive nearshoring, I mean, there's a reason that Intel is trying to get every, local government in America to give them incentives to build more chip fabs. It's because they want to nearshore, more and more chip production so that we're not overly reliant on this tiny island that's in the South China Sea in this contested area next to the world's largest nuclear armed power. I talked today to a company that's a competitor with SpaceX, Relativity Space, and you want to talk about nearshoring, they 3D print all of their rockets in their factory in Southern California from a custom aluminum alloy blend that I don't know where they source it from, but there's plenty of aluminum in the United States. So you want to talk about nearshoring, they're just like, we build the rocket here. The rocket is happening over my shoulder. So I think that companies that have overly complicated supply chains are just going to find themselves unable to deliver goods.
That's really scary. Jonathan says Zeppelins may come back, and we know how the Zeppelins ended the last time, so I'd be worried about that. I know there's so much more we could talk about, Chris, but this has been a fabulous conversation. And Roopa, I know you also learned stuff talking to him tonight.
Thank you. This was great fun, and I hope to see a lot more of your work. And I'm sure you're going to be doing the rounds. So looking forward to hearing more of your stories. And yes, please put that slideshow together. Sounds like you have some fabulous stories in there.
And so one thing we're going to do, Chris, before we let you go, is I'm going to do some housekeeping, talk about something else, but I'm going to come back to you and give you a couple of minutes to just plug the book so that your publishers will be happy with that. So back to you in about 60 seconds. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this show. Thank you so much for being part of this. We have other shows that we do as Digimentors, including the New York Times read-along, where we read the New York Times out loud like crazy people every Sunday. We've been doing that for 6 years, but this week we have a special Washington Post read-along with the Washington Post theater critic, who is Peter Marks, and he used to be the chief drama critic for the New York Times at 9/11. So he's going to be fantastic. And please join us, and Neil Parekh will be hosting that. So that's at 8:30 to 10 on Sunday morning, live and recorded on all of these channels. So please do check it out. Another show we want to tell you, and also coming up in future weeks, we have Jeanette Howard, who's written a big new book, Billie Jean King's autobiography, with her, and it was number 5 on the bestseller list. And so she's going to be with us the following Sunday. And then Jean Pinder will be with us, who was at the New York Times for 23 years and founded Clear Health Costs, a journalism company bringing transparency to healthcare costs. And then Jarrett Adams will be with us, who's a top criminal defense and civil rights attorney who used to be on the other side. He was a defendant and now is a defender. My fight for equity on both sides of a broken system. So those are our shows on Sunday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Eastern. And then every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern is She's on Call. 2 fabulous surgeons, Dr. Sujana Chandrasekhar and Marina Korean, host a conversation about COVID and so much more. And this week on Sunday, heartburn, reflux, and what you can do. So tune in to meet Caitlin Houghton, doctor, and Jonathan Cohen, another doctor. So please join us for that. And then a plug for our friend Rose Horowitz's show that's coming up September 14th. Her show, Women to Follow, a hashtag you must all check out. Her show is about mental health and the judicial system. Judge Ginger Lerner Wren, who presides over the Broward County Mental Health Court in Florida, the nation's first court to be recognized as a specialized mental health court. How amazing is that? And we're talking right at the end here with Christopher Mims, who is the author of a brand new book, Arriving Today, From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and Why What We Buy, about how and what we buy. And I asked Chris to do a final plug for his book.
One thing I think I didn't mention enough in our conversation was, in addition to looking at, how much labor is involved in global supply chains, I really went deep on all the technology. And because I got access to, for example, former Amazon executives who have only talked to the press in a very limited way, or in one case have not talked to the press at all, I think that there are a number of lessons, a number of case studies for anybody who's interested in anything up to and including, automation and AI, and how people have built the systems that, sustain the largest and most valuable companies in the world right now. And, I'm a real I try to be sort of a no bullshit journalist, even though I'm a columnist and I have to do a certain amount of analysis and synthesis. So it's just a really meaty book. And I think that there's going to be a lot in there where people can dig in and be like, well, that was my HBR case study, which was worth the price of entry, hopefully.
Excellent. And there's the book from Harper Business, and it's dropping next week. Is it already available, or is it like
Tuesday? It will appear on your Kindle if you like ebooks, or I hope there are not disruptions in getting physical books to people.
That would be really unfair if that happened to you, but that could be the case study why we need the book. Linda Lawrence is saying thanks for a great conversation. We'll get the book. Apollo is talking about dirigibles, and Longhorn Steve says very interesting. Thank you. And Apollo says that he's going to watch. He has to see her next show that's coming up on Tuesday night. Chris, thank you very much, and Roopa, thank you. That was a lot of fun. And I'm in our daughter's bedroom here, but it's great to see Roopa hosting from the main space. Obviously, Chris has done a good job. Look at the branding of his book, of his employer. It all looks really, really great. So thank you very much. I told Chris this would be about a 35-minute conversation. We are 60 minutes, and we could have kept going, Chris. It was fantastic. Thank you very much. We'll say goodbye to everybody and see you again soon, everyone.